Former political editor at The Guardian, Anushka Asfana, is publishing an insider account of how Keir Starmer rose to be Prime Minister, and it contains some interesting details about how his now closest political ally helped bring Jeremy Corbyn down. Morgan McSweeney is Keir Starmer's Director of Political Strategy in Downing Street, but in 2017 he was setting up an organisation called Labour Together. Now, Labour Together, this nice, fluffy name. The name suggests that it's positioning itself as an organisation hoping to move beyond Labour factionalism. Let's bring everyone together. In fact, though, its principal ambition was to remove Corbynism from the Labour Party. Now, Asfana writes this about a meeting held soon after the 2017 general election. McSweeney made clear his mission to those gathered in the Labour Croydon North MP Steve Reid's parliamentary office, to move the Labour Party from the hard left when JC steps down as leader, and to reconnect the Labour Party with the country and build a sustainable, winning electoral coalition. As Asfana makes clear, the 2017 election had scared people like McSweeney because it showed that far from being totally unelectable, Corbyn had a real chance of entering Downing Street one day. And Asfana says this: interestingly, in a SWOT analysis, so that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, in a meeting, McSweeney claimed that one of the key problems the group might encounter was a Labour government, making explicit that his concerns was not whether Corbyn could win, but that if he were to become Prime Minister, it would prevent the renewal they were focused on, i.e., if Jeremy Corbyn were to get into power, then it might be harder to take over the Labour Party, right? Because if he's in government, then obviously they can't give him the sort of, he's completely unelectable for him because he would have got elected. And it's like, well, we want the party back. So ultimately, we'd prefer them to lose. And in terms of preferring them to lose, they put their money where their mouth is, because McSweeney and his colleagues, generally funded by hundreds of thousands of pounds from venture capitalists and businessmen, immediately got to work trying to undermine Corbyn's chances of winning any future election. So this is from Anushka Asfana again. After a few months working from a park bench, the group funded a small office in Vauxhall, and soon it reached out to former Labour advisors to work alongside them with a focus on online anti-Semitism. In an early review, they identified problem posts in hundreds of Facebook groups with links to either the party or left-wing politics. And that's amazing. Either the party or left-wing politics. That's so vague in terms of its connection to the leadership. Some of those were aimed at Labour's female Jewish MPs. She writes, they then farmed out the posts they uncovered to journalists who were themselves reporting on rising evidence of anti-Semitism on the left, together with a row over whether the party would adopt all the examples linked to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. The scandal was becoming increasingly destabilising for Corbyn. When you scan that, you can say, oh, this is not uncovering a conspiracy, because these were people that were worried about the direction of the Labour Party. Maybe they were worried about the direction of the Labour Party because they saw it as containing anti-Semitism, and then they did everything in their power to sort of shine a light on that anti-Semitism. The context that misses is how ridiculous the media narrative was at this period of time. So what you'd get is the Sunday Times, you get all these different newspapers doing these huge, endless splashes saying there are so many genocidal racists in these Facebook groups associated with Jeremy Corbyn. And it turns out these Facebook groups have absolutely nothing to do with Jeremy Corbyn. You've got, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've expressed some interest in left-wing politics. And you can make a months-long news cycle when about 500 of them post weird things online, or racist things online, indeed, right? That shouldn't really be a news cycle when you're talking about 1 million people. They've got nothing to do with anyone in power. But this was the kind of thing, it seems, that these guys were feeding to the right-wing press. And here's a reminder of the result of anti-Corbyn activists feeding Facebook posts to the right-wing press. This was Owen Jones going head-to-head with a BBC journalist after the Sunday Times had published a front-page report on what a small number of Labour supporters with no connection to the Labour leader had said online.
You know what's happening. You know what that front page splash is all about. I'll give you an example. That Sunday Times splash, because you were leading on it the last hour. I did watch, by the way. And
I'm not disputing what may have been done earlier.
Okay.
What I'm saying to you is, isn't the story of the Sunday Times, presumably if the Sunday Times had found any evidence that linked an individual to it, they would have gone on that. No, they didn't find that.
What they did is went on Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, with hundreds of thousands of posts, millions probably of comments cumulatively, found despicable racist and anti-Semitic comments, then tried to link that to the fact that there were people within the leader's office who are the most committed anti-racists I've probably ever met. Look, I've got an example here, just to show how these splashes work. This so-called journalism, okay? Where's your camera? This is Conservatives Against the EU. It's a Facebook group. It is full of the most despicable racism I've ever seen.
Presumably the Conservative Party would reject
about
it.
About Gina Miller, for example, F off you foreigner, telling them to go back to your homeland.
Fine.
The most despicable racism. You're not making that. Why isn't that? Why is that?
Because presumably Labour is the story at the moment.
Labour is the story at the moment. Now, Ash, when I heard that, because I kind of memory hold some of this, the amount of times sort of where there'd be this sort of right-wing moral panic about what a few people had said on Facebook. And then you say, well, the Tories, the same. And say, well, Labour are the story at the moment. The Tories were never the story. The reason the Tories were never the story is because there weren't people like Morgan McSweeney sort of obsessively feeding these non-stories really to the right-wing press.
Why Labour was unique is because you had Labour insiders and apparatchiks, many of whom were already very close to journalists. Some of these had been quite senior political advisors to, former cabinet ministers and the like, who had these really, really cosy relationships with journalists, where there was a set of shared incentives, where the journalists were annoyed at the rise of the left because it meant that their contacts were useless now. They were ideologically opposed to the rise of the left. And then you also had all of these people who are factional operators who absolutely couldn't stand the idea that they might be out of a job, and who I think were the only people within the borders of Great Britain and Northern Ireland who were like, yeah, Blairism's good. That's still a solid approach for, managing government and the economy, despite it being, almost completely discredited. So you had these two things in alignment, and journalists were so angry at any time you would point out, like, no, you are acting ideologically. You aren't being impartial. This is Labour of the story because you're a journalist and you've made it the story. If you wanted to, you could look at Tory party Islamophobia. You could look at Tory party racism. There were many times where I said to journalists, well, I was racially abused by this Conservative councillor. It's not leading the Today programme. Whereas had that been a Labour Party councillor, particularly one from the left, it would have been all over the news. And they'd be like, oh yeah, well, that's just not the story. And then they would talk about the story as if it exists outside of their own media practice, right? Which is completely, it's beyond belief. The one thing that I would say from having read that Anushka Asthana piece, and this isn't about morality, it's about strategies. I think I look back on those years and I think about all the ways in which I made the wrong strategic call, or I lobbied for something that was unstrategic, or I wasn't focused on what would be more conducive to the goal of winning the 2019 election. And I can give you some examples of this. And this is really me taking a look at my own errors in thinking. So when it got to 2019, I started writing quite publicly about Labour needing to shift to a more Remain position. All right. A more, pro-second referendum kind of position. And I tried to argue it in various different ways. Now, that was done in good faith, right? I thought that would be the best way to resolve the Brexit impasse at the time, but it was also a product of my own biases. What those biases were, that university educated, live in a city, everyone I know voted Remain. And so I was blinded, or perhaps didn't want to see the reality of the political arithmetic in front of us, which is that 52% of the electorate in 2016 voted for Brexit. There were more Leave voting seats for Labour to lose than there were Remain voting seats for Labour to gain. And maybe if I'd been more strategic, the thing I would have been arguing would have been different. Another area of being completely unstrategic was, again, lead up to 2019. A lot of what I was interested in covering was how could you get the leadership to take on more left-wing positions, whether that was on immigration or abolishing private schools or anything. And these are all things which morally I still think are right. Strategically, they weren't right. Because those were all things about, well, how should Labour govern, right? And advancing the sort of left-wing cause within, a proposed manifesto. the right focus, the strategic focus, would have been what will it take for Labour to win in 2019. And when I read that piece by Anushka Asthana, I looked at the view, the sort of disposition of Morgan McSweeney. And while morally and politically I object to every single thing Labour together were doing, they had a tunnel visioned sense of strategic purpose, which I think during those same years the left often lacked. And when I say the left, I'm very much including myself in that.
Yeah, I agree. I'll include myself in that as well, Ash. No, I agree. I actually thought it was quite interesting when they were saying, Morgan McSweeney was reassured when he saw Jeremy Corbyn at Glastonbury with the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing, because he was saying that after the election, after the 2017 election, when Labour got kind of close to power, Corbyn could have sort of started taking it really seriously. He was going to be the next Prime Minister, appealing to the people who didn't quite vote for him in that election. But instead, he sort of went to his happy place and sort of celebrated with the people who had voted for him. I think there is some truth to that. And I think that is, that did come out in that 2019 conference, which I do think was a bit of a disaster, which was sort of like the left a bit high on its own supply, making the manifesto as radical as it could possibly be on every single issue. Obviously, lots of it didn't actually feed into the manifesto, but sort of had set its task as how to make this the most radical policy platform ever, when, Labour were behind in the polls. And it was, it was in retrospect, it was obviously heading for disaster. But as I say, I don't say this is a problem with other people. We were present and also involved, to take a phraseology from the Corbyn years.